Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about some of the trade paperbacks and hardbacks that I've kept throughout the years. With some of the moving around I've done in my life, I really don't tend to keep all the books that I've read, but every now and then I find a book that I really like or that I keep for various other reasons, so I thought I'd talk about that in this video. The first one I'm going to show you is called Why People Believe Weird Things by Michael Shermer. Michael Shermer used to be an evangelical Christian, but then one day he started to realize that science might be a little more relevant to his life than being a Christian is, and kind of went down the skeptic route, and the rest is history, as they say. Another book is called The Science of God. It's by a guy named Gerald Schrader. I think that's how you say that name, Schrader. This is actually a pretty interesting book. It does a lot of things with different science topics and kind of shows how they relate to the Bible in certain ways. And if you're ever on the fence, that one could possibly push you one way or the other. Now, several years ago, 15 years ago, my wife and I decided that we should move to Sweden. She came from Sweden, and I developed an interest in Swedish history after we discussed moving, and I bought this book one day. It's called The Vikings by Robert Ferguson. It basically covers a period from the late 700s to 1100 or so, and it goes over all the different things the Vikings used to do. And unlike what Hollywood would have you believe, they weren't just a bunch of pillagers. They didn't run around destroying villages and kidnapping kids and women as slaves. They did a lot of things. There was a lot of trade. There's a lot of interesting stuff in that book if you ever get a chance to read it. Another book I've read that I really enjoyed was The Plantagenets by Dan Jones. This is an English history book that covers the period from about 1120 to about 1400 or so. And it's all about the royal line and some of the things that the nobles and the kings and stuff did during that time. It's very interesting to see that, especially after you've read or seen something like a Game of Thrones, because you realize that sometimes the fiction doesn't even come close to how mean some of these people were to each other and some of the backstabbing that went on. And then the kind of the sequel to The Plantagenets is a book called The War of the Roses. I actually read this one first because I got it out of the library at Patch Barracks when I worked in Stuttgart, Germany. This book is pretty good. It covers the period from the end of the Plantagenets around 1400 all the way up to about 1525. So it gets you almost to the Henry VIII period of British rule. Then we kind of jump across the ocean to the Caribbean, and we get a book called Under the Black Flag, which is all about pirates. It's basically a general overview of pirates, covering guys like Henry Morgan, Calico Jack, Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, and a guy named Black Bart. Bartholomew Roberts was his real name, I guess. Goes from about the late 1600s to the early 1700s. After that, a lot of them were put on trial and executed or jailed for life. So not much after that. The age of piracy kind of ended around then, I guess. Here's one called In the Kingdom of Ice by Hampton Sides. This one's really interesting. It's about an 1879 expedition to go to try to get to the North Pole. This captain was obsessed with getting to the North Pole to the point where, you know, they got stuck in the ice, as all these stories always seem to end with when you talk about going to the North Pole back in the 1800s and early 1900s. This one's really interesting. For some reason, I don't know why, but I'm I'm terrified of the ocean for the most part. I just going out there and being in the middle of nothing with no place, unless you're near an island, with no place to get to if something really goes wrong, just kind of scares the crap out of me. Not to mention sharks and other dangerous crap that's in the water there. So stuff like that really fascinates me for whatever reason. I also hate the cold, so that's like the double whammy for me, the ocean and the ice. So yeah, another book I've read that I really enjoyed was Eric Larson. Now, I've read a lot of Eric Larson stuff. This one's pretty good. This is about the sinking of the Lusitania, which was an event that a lot of Americans are taught was what pulled the United States into World War One. This one's pretty good because it talks about the Lusitania itself, and it also gives the story kind of from the viewpoint of a German U-boat captain. Another book I have here for this one goes to World War II. It's Unexplained Mysteries of World War II. This one's basically full of little vignettes about weird stuff that happened during World War II, kind of unexplained things. And I always thought that if I ever decided to write some sort of weird World War II story, maybe I could use something in there to create some sort of narrative based around real events. Another World War II book, Servants of Evil, talking about a lot of the Nazi Germany stuff, a lot of the soldiers and some of the things they did to people. So, pretty good book. And this is probably my favorite World War II book that I've read so far, and it's called Plotting Hitler's Death by Joachim Fest. If you've seen the Tom Cruise movie Valkyrie, this book covers that story in great detail, and it's a really good read, and it blew my mind. The movie takes some liberties with what this book says actually happened. Some of the characters are a little different. Some of the endings or some of the characters are a little different. But for the most part, the movie got it fairly close from what I can tell. I'm no historian, though, so take that with a grain of salt, I guess. But if you want to know what happened with that plot to kill Hitler, this is the book to get. Now, we get into Hitler and the occult here. This one's called Unholy Alliance. It's basically talks about Hitler's obsession with the occult and finding various things like I think it's the spear of Longinus, which is supposedly the spear that was used to stab Jesus Christ when he was on the cross, and various things like that. It goes into like the Nazi mysticism that Heinrich Himmler was all into and that kind of stuff. So interesting book there. This is one I read recently because of some of the events going on in the United States. I just wanted to see if what I was seeing was comparable to anything that happened during World War II. And this one's called Gestapo. And it's an interesting book, kind of scary, some of the stuff in this. There's some definite parallels to things you've seen in other totalitarian regimes around the world. So yeah, if you ever want to be scared about what could happen when the wrong people are in power, try to read this book. Here's another book that I've kept because I've got an interest in World War II stuff like a lot of people. It's called Hitler's Last Days. Bill O'Reilly had something to do with it. So whether you're a fan of his or not, this book's a pretty light read. It's not super detailed, but it's got some interesting stuff in it, and it'll give you a decent overview. Sticking with the Bill O'Reilly thing, this is something my wife bought me for Christmas one year because she knows I'm interested in World War II, obviously. So it's Killing the Rising Sun, which is by Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard. Again, if you're looking for details about the Manhattan Project, this really isn't the book. But if you want a decent overview of what happened during the end of World War II, along with the development of the atomic bomb, that's a decent book to give you an overview. Now, I am not big on biographies. I tend to find the stuff about people's childhoods kind of boring. And a lot of biographies tend to start there because they want you to see the formative stuff, I guess, of why that person might be the way they are. But this book didn't really do that too much. It's called Trumbo by a guy named Bruce Cook. And this book just, I don't know what it was about it, but it just sucked me in, and it was extremely interesting. This is Bryan Cranston on the cover here because he played Dalton Trumbo in a movie called Trumbo. And it was a pretty good movie, pretty faithful to the book here, which was based on Dalton Trumbo's life. And if you don't know, he was a screenwriter that was blacklisted in Hollywood during the McCarthyism era. And he started writing under various names and wrote a lot of movies. I can't, I think he wrote Spartacus under a different name. And eventually it took another Hollywood producer that didn't give a crap about the blacklist to actually bring him out of his kind of exile. Even though he was still working, it was tough for him. So really good book there. And the last of the history books I'm going to go over is about submarine warfare. Well, not warfare, more about submarine spy work. It's called Blind Man's Bluff. And this basically goes over a lot of the use of submarines during the Cold War and using them to do various spy missions, whether it was tapping undersea cables or trying to just sneak into places to see what was going on with Russian bases and that kind of thing. It's a very good book. So now we get to the trade paperback fiction books that I've kept. And this one a lot of people will be familiar with because it's pretty famous. World War Z. This book is really good. It tells about a zombie apocalypse, but it tells it kind of after the fact. And it's basically like a reporter is talking to different people that were involved with the apocalypse. And as it goes along, you, the reader, get to piece together everything in your own head and how it all came about. So really good book. Don't compare this to the movie. The Brad Pitt movie is nothing like this book. And here's one called To Reign in Hell by Stephen Brust. I don't know how easy it would be to find this anymore, but this basically talks about a war in heaven between the angels because they revolt for whatever reason. They're tired of God's decrees and that kind of stuff, I guess. I don't remember. It's been a long time since I read this one, but I kept it because some of the names in it were interesting, and just I find stories like that kind of interesting. Now, Philip K. Dick, the Philip K. Dick reader. This thing is full of Philip K. Dick short stories. And, you know, if you know anything about science fiction, Philip K. Dick's name should be familiar to you. He's responsible for the short stories that generated a lot of movies like Minority Report and Total Recall. And there are a lot of others that are less well known that actually movies were made out of them. I think Screamers was another one. But anyway, this is a pretty good book. A lot of entertaining stories in it if you like short fiction. And then sticking with the short fiction motif, we get someone who is kind of an acquired taste for some, but I kind of fell in love with his writing as soon as I started reading him, and that is Harlan Ellison. This one's called Alone Against Tomorrow, and it's like, this book is actually older than me, I think. I got this in a yard sale with an auction at work that had like 20 or 30 books in it that were all hardbacks like this. And once I finally read this, I was just like, wow, this guy is amazing. Which caused me to go out and buy a whole bunch more. So I've got this one here. This is Angry Candy. And this is Shatterday, this one's got some really, really great stories in it. And then I also got the Essential Ellison up there on the shelf. It's like a 1,200 page retrospective of his career over 50 years. And I haven't had the time to tackle it yet, but I'll get to it one of these days. Now back to novels, it looks like. And I've got this one, which you've probably seen in bargain bins or marked down in a lot of bookstores, but it's Replay by Ken Grimwood. It's basically about a guy who dies, but then he wakes up and he's like, I think he's 6 years old again, but he still has all the knowledge from the first time he died. And this keeps happening to him. So the timeline changes each time he does it. So it's pretty good book. Now, I've said before that I love books that feature real world events or real world unexplained events and try to give them a fantastical explanation based on characters that somebody has created. This one here is by Mark Hodder. It's called The Strange Affair of Spring-Heeled Jack, which Spring-Heeled Jack was a real historical figure. If you get a chance, look it up. It's a pretty weird story. But this book is really excellent. It's a really good book. The main character is Sir Richard Francis Burton, and he's trying to figure out what's going on, why this guy keeps popping up in weird places and stuff like that, and what his purpose for being there is. So if you get a chance, this is probably one of my top 20 books of all time. I really loved this book when I read it. And then there's the second book in that series, which is called The Curious Case of the Clockwork Man. And this one was as good as, if not slightly better than The Strange Affair of Spring-Heeled Jack, because there are things going on in this book that if you're not really paying attention, you don't realize it until the very end when everything comes crashing down and you find out exactly what's going on. It's a really great book. And then we've got one that's pretty famous in science fiction circles, Altered Carbon by Richard K. Morgan. There's a Netflix series for this. There's like 2 other books in the series, but I haven't read those yet. Altered Carbon was pretty good, kind of a science fiction mystery thing, and it's a decent book. Then we get to my favorite author, Tim Powers. These are smaller books here that I've got. This is The Bible Repairman and Other Stories. It's just a bunch of short fiction that he's written over the years. There's a little chapbook that I've got from The Bible Repairman. And here is my trade paperback version, copy of The Last Call, or of Last Call, I should say, not The Last Call, of Last Call. This is probably the 3rd book I read by Tim Powers, and I really enjoyed this one a lot. Got another one here by a guy named William Ashbliss, but William Ashbliss is, I guess, a construction or a creation of Tim Powers and James Blaylock. But yeah, if you can find a copy of this, I don't know how this may be valuable. I don't know. And then I've got my trade paperback copy of On Stranger Tides. I also have a mass market paperback copy of it, and I've got an ebook of it. I've got an ebook of most of these Tim Powers books. And then another collection of his rare short fiction called Strange Itineraries, full of pretty good stories in that. And then we get to the hardbacks that I've got sitting over here. The first one I'll talk about it was edited by Greg Binford and Martin Greenberg. I think Martin Greenberg really liked to do like historical or alternate history anthologies, but this one's called Hitler Victorious, and that's the whole premise right there in the title. If Hitler was victorious, what would have happened? And there's some pretty good stories in this book here. And then we've got something that probably every science fiction fan has tried to read or has read, and that is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So this is like the whole thing up to So Long and Thanks for All the Fish. So enjoyable stuff. I've read that once or twice. Now we get to a book that I've kept not because I liked it, but because I've been waiting for the actual finish of the story since I read this book when it came out. The book is Territory by Emma Bull, and it's about the lead up to the gunfight at the OK Corral. And the thing is, this book never gets there. I don't know if she had a 2-book deal or a 3-book deal, but I've been waiting forever for book 2 to come out so that this story would continue, because the way this ends is not really that great. But I've kept it all these years on the off chance that she'll actually finish it someday. And then we get to Clive Barker book, The Thief of Always. And at one point, I was pretty much buying anything Clive Barker wrote. And the other thing about this book is, as I've said before, I'm kind of a sucker for books with illustrations. And this one has, this one's full of illustrations. And they were actually done by Clive Barker himself as part of the book. These are just a couple that I'm showing you. Interesting illustrations in this book. So yeah. And then we get to this really well-written kind of a period piece. Takes place in the early 1900s. It's called Carter Beats the Devil. And Carter is basically a stage magician who is as good as, if not better than, Houdini. And he ends up getting pulled into a plot to help Warren G. Harding, the President of the United States. So all around, really good book. Then we've got a couple. Here we go with William Ashbliss again. This is like the Memorial Cookbook. There's some stuff in this. I bought it mainly because it was Tim Powers and that kind of thing. And then another one here, The Devil in the Details. Another Tim Powers book, but also written with William Ashbliss. And then my hardcover copy of The Anubis Gates, which has actually been signed by Tim Powers, I think. Yeah, signed by Tim Powers. So, you know, I used to work with a guy that knew Tim Powers personally and visited him whenever he went to LA for business. So he was able to get a bunch of Tim Powers books signed for me, including Declare, which I have here. And unfortunately, this one's not signed. This is my hardback copy of 3 Days to Never. And that's all I have for the Tim Powers stuff. And then last, but as you'll see, certainly not least, we have R.A. Salvatore and the Dark Elf, Drizzt Do'Urden. I've got a bunch of these in hardback. So here's the Dark Elf trilogy, which is Homeland, Exile, and Sojourn. And then we've got the Icewind Dale trilogy, which is, I think, the Crystal Shard, Streams of Silver, and the Halfling's Gem. That's those three there. And then we've got a whole bunch of books that come after that. The Legacy, which is pretty decent. And then we've got Starless Night. Now, this book has one of the greatest sword battle endings that I have ever read, and I remembered it to this day. When I picked this book up earlier to look at it, I still remember the line that just got me, and I was just like, holy crap, that was good. So if you ever start reading these books, look forward to the end of this one, because this one is amazing. And then, you know, keep going. Siege of Darkness here, Passage to Dawn. And we get to Silent Blade, which comes next. And then this one was not one of my favorites. This one focuses mainly on Wulfgar and is a fairly simple story, not too complicated. It's called The Spine of the World. It's basically Wulfgar after he's left the Heroes of the Hall, and he's gone off kind of on his own, and he gets involved with this woman that needs his help, and it's okay. It's not super great. Then we get to the Sea of Swords, which I don't remember much about this book. And, you know, we get to the Hunter's Blades trilogy. Here's book 1, The Thousand Orcs, which I have. Book 2, The Lone Drow. I remember this one being pretty good because Drizzt ends up, I think this is the one where he ends up talking to some frost giants, which is pretty good. And then you've got The Two Swords here, which is a pretty good book. And then the last few, these are the ones that focus mainly on Jarlaxle and Artemis Entreri. That's Servant of the Shard, The Promise of the Witch King, and then Road of the Patriarch. You know, this has been out for years, but I finally got around to reading it this year, and I really enjoyed it and wished that I had read it years ago, but enjoyable book. So anyway, that's a bunch of the hardbacks and trade paperbacks I've read in fiction and nonfiction, stuff that I've kept over the years. So hopefully you've got stacks of books like this that you enjoy, that you've kept around just in case you ever want to reread them. Hopefully you've enjoyed this review of old books that I've kept for whatever reason. I don't know if I'll ever get rid of them. Maybe sell them someday, maybe just pass them down to my kids. I don't know. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.